Okay, I am very excited to bring Stephanie LeBlanc-Godfrey up to the stage. As I said earlier, she's the global head of community inclusion programs for women of color at Google. And I love how Stephanie says this. Her work at Google is in service of women of color and caregivers, to create community where it doesn't naturally exist, and to influence the policies, the programs, and the processes that impact their sense of belonging and inclusion. Stephanie, welcome to EmTech Next.
Hi, everyone.
Thank you so much for being here. I have so many questions. I'm sure there'll be a lot of questions too in the audience, but I'm gonna get started with a few. So,
all right, let's do it.
You've been at Google for 8 years. You've seen a lot in that time. So how has the DEI strategy evolved over the past 8 years?
Yeah, so I started in 2014, which was actually the first year that we publicly shared our diversity annual report. And that report has been shared each year since. And it includes our hiring, representation, and attrition numbers at the intersection of race and gender. And so that gives a snapshot to the public, right? Making that public statement of where we are and where we hope to be. And that's where we started in 2014. And since then, the role that I had in 2014 is not the same role that I have now. And this role is a direct outcome of using data, right? We all know Google is a data-centric company. And so, from the results of the Diversity Annual Report, in addition to our results from our internal employee survey, which showed a disparate experience for women of color compared to the overall company, is how my role came to be, of saying we want to invest in these community groups in a very specific and particular way because of what the data is showing. And so that's where my work comes in focusing on that specific community group.
And in the past 2 years, I imagine a lot has also continued to change. There's a lot of pressure on the private sector to step up and lead in things like racial justice, mental health, caregiving. How have you and your colleagues addressed those issues internally at Google? What are the kind of resources, programs, initiatives that you've been focusing on?
Yeah, so, the pandemic has been a catalyst for change in terms of the information and how things are being shared. And so the work that we did 2 years ago in person couldn't be the same work that we did when we were in, an at-home setting. And so we've really focused on, in looking at the 6 components of the employee life cycle. So everything from attracting talent to what does it look like when they leave our company. What are the ways in which we can connect, find the data, test and iterate on the findings that we have to drive impact, right? What we often hear and what companies often zero in on really quickly is, okay, we need to just hire more of X type of person. And the reality is that's not always the solve, nor is it a sustainable solve to just focus on one data point or one moment. And so it has to be holistic. How are we recruiting? Where are we going to recruit talent? And where can we expand and be more diverse in terms of the conferences and places in which we try to find our talent? Professional development. What vendors are we using? And who are they speaking to? And how can we ensure that they are inclusive in the scenarios that they talk about within the trainings, and are inclusive of the different lived experiences and cultures that will be at the table and experiencing these trainings as well. One of the things that I often say is that in the work that I do, and the work that we all do, we don't want to cause trauma to the very communities that we're trying to serve. And so we always have to wear that hat of taking a look of who's not included, who's not being mentioned, or who's being more focused on versus others, so that you can bring that balance and bring in folks versus having folks feel excluded, because then that's what causes the breakdown, the isolation, and quite frankly, people leaving along with the Great Resignation, right? That's one of the components I truly believe of what's happening with the Great Resignation now.
Yeah. So how do you think about inclusion and belonging? We're going to have Future Forum here tomorrow. They have found recently that that underrepresented groups' sense of belonging has grown fastest in double digits for Black and Latinx employees over the pandemic. So I'm curious what that means to you, what that data represents to you.
So when I first saw that piece of data, I was like, wait, what's the time frame for that? That's really critical and really telling, right? So if over the past 2 years that there are certain community groups that are feeling more included when they are not in the physical space of a company, that means that as we're in this return to work phase, what are we going to do to keep that number from dropping off a cliff, right? And so I think the importance there is that when we talk about flexibility, you can work from home some days and others, it has to be flexibility and we talked about this, that flexibility and not having a penalty for working from home, not having a penalty for that flexibility, which we're touting, but yet still we're seeing numbers where those who are in the office are actually still, reaping the benefits of career progression. And so although flexibility is such a key word, we have to put that and to it so that, again, we're ensuring that all tides are rising for folks who are remote and folks who are in the office, so that all can have that career progression that they really want.
Yeah. Do you have any ideas on how to do that? I mean, I know we talked about like kind of setting the floor and the ceiling. So a lot of people say like, you can come back. Just come back about 2 days a week. But we know that women, employees of color, and caregivers are more likely to choose flexibility, and so you don't want to have a two-tier workforce. So what do you do?
Yeah, there's a lot of pieces to that. I think one part of it, and Google has spoken and has done a lot of research and put out a lot of content around psychological safety, right? There is a huge need for that for folks within the community groups that you mentioned to be able to share what their current circumstances are to enjoy that flexibility. And so the second piece is when you have companies tend to employ perks like unlimited PTO days, right? And that feels like it's, okay, we're just giving you sort of carte blanche access to do what's right for you. What that ends up doing is actually further marginalizing the community groups of women and caregivers and people of color. They're already feeling burdened by what are people thinking about me? Am I getting the work done the way that they want me to? And there's all of this psychological work that takes place in that. And then when there's vagueness on a policy, then they feel, well, if I did take the days, will they actually think it's okay because it's unlimited? Just all of this mental vicious cycle that we go through. And so I err on the side of be really particular, be really specific, and then allow room for, edge cases to come in. But it's better that there's a clear and well-written policy that everyone can follow so that one person doesn't feel like they're taking advantage of the system because of all of the internal sort of thinking based on real stories, right? It's not made up, but being able to, use the benefits and the perks and the programs that are available to them without that extra mental gymnastics as to how they will be perceived by taking advantage of those.
I think that's great advice, to make the implicit explicit. And also it's a great opportunity to be, if you're changing how you work or coming back to an office, to re-onboard employees and to be really explicit about team culture and norms. Seems like a really important thing to be doing right now.
Yeah, and I would even touch on that. A lot of organizations tend to look at big companies to see what they're doing and then copy paste. And I want to caution against that, right? It sounds great to, have a Zen room and have all of these things, but the questions that leaders and executives should be asking themselves and each other is, who is asking for it? Who wants it? How will it actually move the needle in terms of retaining and inclusion and sentiments of belonging? It sounds good, but let's play this Zen room out. You put a Zen room, no one goes into it because they're like, I don't know why that's here, but okay. Do I nap in it? Is that okay? Like, what's happening here? And then your company grows, and now you need to change that Zen room into an office. So now the office perception is you are taking away, even though no one used it, you are taking away this mental health benefit for an office, right? For something that wasn't even used. And so I use that example to really, when you think through and you see what, tech companies and startups and, the cool companies are doing, that you really take the time to assess how that can fit into your culture and how that can actually meet the needs of your employees versus what looks cool on paper.
Yeah, that's so smart, because you're right. I think a lot of people are like, what does Google do as a comp for their business,
right,
no matter what their business is?
Right.
I want to talk a little bit about employee activism. So there's been a shift during the pandemic. Employees are expecting so much from their employers. They're expecting them to speak out about issues that they really care deeply about. They want to be really values aligned with their organization. They're speaking up louder than ever. And I'm curious how you have evolved in your role, the conversations that you're having, and the kind of work that you're doing in this era of employee activism.
Yeah, so, the pandemic for sure has catapulted employee activism into the next dimension. And the reason being, for the first year, I would say the first 3 months, right? Everyone's like, oh my God, look at my pet, look at my kids, look at my partner. I'm in my kitchen, living room, bathroom, doing work. Like, it was all sort of like fun and games to like show people all the crazy places where we worked. But we really shifted the intimacy of the working relationships with our colleagues because they got to see where we live. But the impact of that is that as the racial reckonings have then also taken place during the pandemic, you can't talk about like the thing that's happening in your background and not talk about the thing that's impacting you in your heart around a cultural moment in society that's impacting maybe not directly you, but family members, community members. And so that line between working and being at home has been completely blurred to the point where you have to talk about the thing. There's no longer this neutral workspace where we can just walk into the building and pretend that the outside world doesn't exist. It exists here at home because home is now where you work. And I think that has been a huge prompt for employees to speak up, because guess what? That wasn't the first Black man that died. It wasn't the first instance of Asian hate. It wasn't the first transgression against our LGBT communities and so many other groups. It didn't kick off in 2020, and we're now reacting to it. It's something that has been here, but now the way in which we engage with each other, now the way in which we communicate and see each other as humans has changed, and so therefore we can't ignore it. And so we are, in a most positive way, using our voices to bring these things to our employers. Now, for the employers, that's not easy, right?
Yeah.
Being a manager has never been easy, but now, and someone mentioned this earlier, it's been a theme, right? Managers went from just doing their responsibility, what was on the job description, to now having to figure out how to communicate and create spaces that may or may not have already existed, to understand the issues that they may or may not have ever been proximate to, and figure out how to navigate that and still get the job done and still meet the needs of employees who are like, I'm ready to burn this place down if you don't do something about it, right?
Yeah.
So, I think that there is this space, as we're talking about the future of work, we have to talk about what the future of management is. How do we support our managers to be able to have the competencies to meet the needs of employees so that they are staying Again, also part of the Great Resignations. When organizations keep quiet, then that's a signal to employees that our values are not aligned. And that value misalignment is becoming more and more highlighted and important to individuals as we feel like this place is kind of burning just a little bit, that, that they want to be in a place and spend all the hours that we do have working in a place that will say something, that will speak out against things. And so that is really important for us to do that investment in our leaders so that they can rise to the occasion and meet those needs.
It's such an important point. I mean, I think you're right. Like if you were a great manager in February 2020, you were managing your employees' output from maybe 9 to 5. But now, to be a great manager, you are positively impacting the lives and livelihoods of your employees, their families, their communities, and that's a totally different job. So how do you hold leaders accountable for progress? I mean, we're talking a little bit about a lot of companies spoke up, specifically in the summer of 2020 after the murder of George Floyd, and then their actions and words didn't line up. And there's been really slow or no progress at some of these organizations. So how do you, from where you sit, hold leaders and organizations accountable?
Sure. So I think this type of work is three things, right? It's hard work. We all know that. It's heart work, and it's also homework. And so the very, goals that companies espouse to have in terms of DEI have to reflect the goals and positions that you hold in your home life, right? In terms of, let's call it hiring and representation, right? You have these goals, but what does the hiring look like in your home? Who's your doctor? Who's your accountant? Who's your interior designer? Like, who are the people that are taking on leadership roles within your life that don't look like you? Because when you have people that don't look like you in your personal life that hold leadership roles, you can see the connection where, man, there's no one that looks like these other folks in my home life that are represented in my my work life. And so it's really important to do that homework. Brian Stevenson said, you have to be proximate to have that empathy, to have that understanding. And so there isn't and there can't be a separation of church and state. I'll also quote Brene Brown, who said that there is no difference between, personal or professional values. They're one and the same. Who you are at home, right? It can look different, but the core of who you are stays the same. And so you can't say that you're this diversity champion and be on the diversity council and be the executive sponsor for ERGs, and then when you go home, you're in a homogeneous environment in every aspect of your home life. How then do you turn that on? How then in the moment do you react to things at work in a really genuine and authentic way if you don't have that muscle and you aren't working that muscle out in your home life? And so that accountability is when you're appointing people to work in these roles within the company is, what does your home life look like? How are you doing this work? What are you reading? What are you exposing yourself to? Or who are you exposing yourself to so that you can ensure it's a holistic piece, right? Because we all read leadership books at home. Are we reading D&I books? Are we reading history books when we're at home so that it helps us to show up in that way at work? And so that's the challenge and the imperative that I put on all of us as leaders is that we continue to blur that work and home piece for D&I and really, make that change home into the workplace.
Thank you for saying that. I've actually never heard that on a DEI panel, and I've been to a lot of DEI panels. It's really important. But the idea that for so many of us, the most diverse place we ever are our workplaces, and our training and understanding and learning about how to be more inclusive is happening in that workplace. And then we go home, and some of you might know this, but as you pointed out, our networks are really racially homogenous. I think I remember the stat is 91% of a white person's network is white. And networks are how we build empathy and understanding. It's how we gain access to jobs. And
that's
so
the thing, right? We have to be intentional about it. We know the stat. We can quickly run through our Rolodex and either affirm it or be an anomaly to it. But then what do we do about it, right? It's not going to fall into your lap to have a mixed group of people in your life that have diverse lived experiences. And, thanks to the work that has been happening in 2022, it's literally a Google search away. What are the top LGBT brands for skincare? What are Black-owned brands? I changed. I don't use Bounty. I now use a Black-owned business called Real for toilet paper and paper towel. It's one thing, but it's supporting now a Black-owned business that then impacts legacy and something that I could share. Hey, Erin, use Real. It's easy. Delivers to your house. You never have to think about it again. Simple little things like that changes your makeup and the way that you view things when you start to practice intentionality around changing your environment to make it more diverse.
Yeah, I love that. Okay, I've been hogging all the questions. I will share. Okay, are there any questions in the audience? Task. Okay, well, let's see. Oh, I see one right here.
Hi.
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 Oh, hi.
Dag.
Yeah, we know.
Thank you for the work that you're doing. The question kind of related to the homework piece is how much energy or resources within Google do you guys think about even primary or secondary education, like early education and that outreach before it sort of shows up at the doorstep of like, this is not a problem that just arrives at our doors. Sort of inclusivity is a deeper, this is a long-term effort. And in terms of just not showing up with like adults, but like early primary or secondary education?
Yeah, that's a good question. And, my response to that is that each of us are either attached to a child in some way, whether biologically or being a godparent, having friends who have children. And so Erin and I talk about this all the time of how can you bring children on the journey with you, right? As you're learning, right? We're all on this journey together. For some of us, it's kind of slapped us in the face harder than others. And so I urge you to grab a child, grab a young adult, and go on this journey with them and find creative and age-appropriate ways for you to engage with them and learn with them about the things that you're learning about within this space. And I spoke with the woman from Patreon. I forgot her name at the moment. But I support this organization called the Conscious Child.
Yeah.
Right, Conscious Child.
I'll just kid. Yeah.
Right.
I'll just kid, I think, right?
Now I forgot.
No, I forget, but yes.
Dang it.
Well.
We'll get it out. But like the Conscious Child, which really provides books, book reviews, curriculums, and like conversation starters around this type of work for kids so that like we don't always have it figured out how to talk to even peers, let alone children. But there are organizations out there that are doing that work and providing those resources. And so again, it's a Google search away to be able to find that. It just takes time. And I know that there's, a rampant amount of stuff that we all need to learn about and understand about all the different community groups that make up America, and so that could feel overwhelming. But I encourage you, there are tons of leadership skills that need to be known and information, and so you just choose the pieces that resonate the most with you and just go deep on that one. Mm-hmm. Right? You don't have to boil the ocean.
It's the Conscious Kid, confirmed.
Yes.
Thank you, Kevin.
That's good. Support them on Patreon.
Any other questions in the studio? We have some questions online too. Okay, so we have a question from online. You mentioned the importance of working with diverse and inclusive vendors. From a practical standpoint, are there any specific resources or best practices if I'm looking to make sure my company's vendors are diverse and inclusive?
Yeah, so one of the the projects that I've worked on is an author series. So bringing authors in that talk about a myriad of topics. And so as part of that, we do book buys. And so oftentimes they would either send us to their publisher, but one of the ways that I wanted to turn that on its head is like, how do we find underrepresented book buyer or a book distributor? And so literally emailing, saying, hey, do you do bulk buys for companies? And that has been they've been extremely receptive, and I've had a lot of success. Sometimes it takes a little bit longer, right? And I have this conversation with a lot of folks internally where we either don't have the time or we have, a certain budget. But if we're looking for diverse vendors, there needs to be that grace in getting the time or spending a little bit more so that we can support these groups who are trying to build the next HarperCollins or whatever. But we can't do it if it's like, you're just going to take too long. You're not in the system. All of these things, we have to be able to kind of sit and remove those roadblocks so that we can set it up to be an easier process in the future. And so Google has, little icons on businesses that denotes whether it's LGBT or Asian-owned or Black-owned and so forth. And so there's a lot of resources that have compiled those vendor pieces ahead of time. And so I try to do that. And even if I'm not able to use them for this particular time, I'll at least do the work to get them in the system so that for the next time, that they're available, right? Knowing what we know about the racial wealth gap within the United States, we can't say that we want to work on it and then say, your prices are too high. Guess what? Because they're not a conglomerate, right? Or you're going to take too much time. Guess what? It's one or two people that own the business. And so if we really want to attack that, then we've got to loosen up some of the restrictions that we impose on then what they should look like when we engage with them.
Right. That's such a good, yes, you're right, making a conscious choice. Also, I love that suggestion because there's both the system that anyone, in a leadership mostly can do, and then also that anybody can really do. Like anybody can Google a Black-owned bookstore, for example. Great. I think we have is there another question in the audience? Okay, well, good. I have more questions. Okay, so we said at the top, that there was a SHRM study that found 76% of organizations have no DEI goals. Many people here, no surprise, do have diversity and inclusion goals. So for anyone listening right now that's at an organization that does not have any DEI program, DEI goals, what is your advice to them? How do they get started?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of ways. One is taking a look at the data that already exists and seeing how that portrays itself within your organization, so you can kind of figure out where the areas are that you want to target. I had mentioned the employee life cycle. So again, looking at from how you're attracting talent, how you're recruiting them, what are your onboarding practices looking like? And so tackling, one piece of it at a time. And then also asking your employees, right? That employee pulse survey can be really useful to get the data. Because again, what you might be thinking, which is what the knee-jerk reaction is, like more representation. Okay, then you're going to have 10% of unhappy group X, right? So that actually doesn't solve it. What we need to focus on is what are the employees that we do have here? How do we retain them? What's going to keep them here? How are we investing in their career progression? And so focusing on all of those needs, right, will pay dividends within itself, because then it will have the retention numbers that we're looking for. You now have ambassadors who are going to talk well about your company at recruiting events. And so it kind of builds on itself, but you have to work on the home piece first, instead of trying to bring more people of all the colors of the rainbow into it, and then you're just increasing the number of happy people. Or you get the leaky bucket where you're increasing the hiring, but then they're going right out the back door.
Yeah. So no surprise, someone at Google is telling us to look at the data.
Look at the data, man.
Okay, we have 1 minute left. I'm going to group, there's a few questions that are kind of related. So just what advice do you have for leaders and managers? How can they adopt a learning posture around diversity and inclusion?
Yeah, I was about to say that's a great question. It is a great question, but I hate when you keep saying that it's a great question. You know, and we had talked about this at dinner last night, that the skills, the mindset that got you to where you are today is not going to be the skills and the mindset and the strengths that will get you through the next leg of this race. This race now looks different from where we were going or where we were comfortable in the status quo. And so therefore we have to get uncomfortable. We have to do the work to learn. We've got all the books, all the executive coaches, all the professional development opportunities to build our business muscle. Now we need to invest in these other muscles to get us to where we need to be. And so it's not a ding on you if you've kind of go back to school, quote unquote, to do the work and get the learning and build up your skills. It's just you using your smarts and your brains to know that to get to the next leg of the race, I've got to do something different and I've got to switch. It's not a personal affront to your knowledge and what you've built up to that point in time, but it just won't get you to the next part.
Yeah. Thank you, Stephanie. I learn so much from you every time we talk, and I'm so glad. I'm sure everyone is furiously taking notes. So thank you. Thank you, Stephanie.
Thank you.